Great job, everybody. You've heard me talk enough to know that I'm really big on building community, and that's why I want us all to wear name tags, because I think that's a start. I didn't wear mine today. But I just want to say one thing that you might not know, and that is in terms of trying to keep making connections in here, who is who. Claire, who sings for us, is the daughter of Todd, who did our Kairos moment today. So if you had not put that together, now you know. And I would like to say that Todd and I both went to Abilene Christian University for our master's degree, so there you go. So I'm guessing that a whole lot of us in here raised our children or our grandchildren, maybe ourselves, on the Muppets in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, right?
I did.
Yeah, good. Between the two of them and Jesus, we got a pretty good launching place for talking about God in the neighborhood. The Muppets taught us to sing, and I teased Tom and Brad in the meeting last week. I told them I was going to sing. That's really scary to them, so I hope they've been sweating to this moment. I'm not going to sing. I'm going to remind you that the Muppets sang, who are the people in your neighborhood? Well, they're the people you meet each day, and they put emphasis on the grocer and the utility worker and the kids down the street who are new and the firemen and the police. And then Mr. Rogers sang, I've always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in the neighborhood with you, assuring that watching child that he or she would be a great neighbor and teaching how completely natural it is for us to care for each other and to take care of each other and help each other, all the while he was putting on his iconic sweater. And then there's Jesus, raising the stakes, answering the question, who is my neighbor, by telling a memorable story, a famous story that says, well, it's the unlikely person who came up as the hero of the story, the unexpected person who did right by the person who was in trouble. That causes us to ask, would I be willing for my enemy to help me? Or certainly, would I help my enemy or some other unlikely person? Once a woman told me about the last day of her husband's life. He had been on hospice for several days, and there had been nurses in the house all these days. Well, on the day that he died, there was an ice storm brewing. And he, by this time, had fallen into a coma. And she knew that she just didn't want to be alone that night. So she called the hospice coordinator and said, please be sure to send a nurse tonight. Well, the coordinator was having a very difficult time finding someone because of the storm. She called and even began to offer more money if someone would come and take that night shift. Finally, she found someone, but it was a nurse who lived an hour and a half away. So she called the wife, and she said, I found someone, but I don't know her. We've never used her before. So at 8 p.m., the doorbell rang, and the wife opened the door to the unknown hospice nurse. At this point in time, the wife began to describe that nurse to me. And the way she talked, the things she said, made me think that possibly she harbored some prejudices by the way she described the woman. Well, she went on to say that the woman just burst into the room like a whirlwind, barking orders. Where is the patient? Go fetch pillows from the next room, and plopping her Whataburger bag down on the silk chair. The wife was overcome by the strength of this nurse's personality, but she obeyed anyway, even with a little agitation. So she showed up in the bedroom where her husband lay with the pillows that she had fetched, and the nurse began to strip the man of his clothing, cover him with a sheet, put the pillows around his body as if a cocoon, and then, the wife told me, the nurse began to tenderly wash his face and to bathe the rest of his body. As the night wore on, the nurse began to speak in spiritual tones that this wife was not used to. She said, oh, I can feel the strength of your relationship. I can just feel it in my own body. It's here. And she said, I don't think he'll die as long as you're in the room. Now, the wife telling me the story said she felt like she was being invited to leave the room and let him die. And she said, I thought to myself, I will not be told what to do. In fact, no, I'm going to get in the bed with him. And that she did. And she held him all night long. At 6 a.m., the couple's 2 dogs came into the room, jumped in the bed as they did every day, and they began to bounce around. And the woman said it was time for them to eat. So I said to my husband and to the nurse, I'm just going to the kitchen. I'm going to feed the dogs. I'll be right back. No sooner had she opened the pantry door, gotten the food out and shut it, she turned and the nurse was standing there. And she said, he's gone. The wife went on to tell me about her feelings in that moment of the great grief that she was experiencing. But then she surprised me and said, and I called the hospice coordinator and I told them how wonderful that nurse was. And so there in the neighborhood of that house, 2 women with the shadow of death between them and all around them experienced something amazing. The wife experienced an unexpected blessing from this hospice nurse that she did not know, this stranger whom she had described to me in a certain way. I wonder how the nurse would tell that story. I wonder if the man could speak, how he would tell it about that night of shared space with the woman he loved so much and this stranger. Now, of course, most of the time when we talk about neighborhoods, we think about, the street we live on, the area of town we're in with its schools and its churches and its green space and all the spaces that we share. And we wave at our neighbors when we go by and we help them find their lost dogs, and maybe we water their plants when they're away. And we see the same people at the dry cleaner and the lady who stands at the cash register. And most of us feel a great deal of tenderness and sentimentality about this place of shared faces and spaces. And we love that, and we have sentimental feelings about it because it adds to our sense of well-being and security and connectedness. I had an experience when we lived up in North Richland Hills, just up the road from here. We lived in a development called Hometown, and there were about 400 houses there. And most of the households, I think, had school-age children, though there were some of us who did not. Something terrible happened in the neighborhood, and the news quickly spread. One of the families had invited a neighbor kid to go with them on a weekend trip to the lake. The neighbor kid couldn't wait. He and his little friend jumped into the car, and as soon as the car stopped, those boys were out of the car running straight for the lake. The neighbor kid was first. He jumped off of the boathouse. He landed awkwardly, and he drowned. When the news got back to our neighborhood, someone suggested that we should tie a white ribbon around every pole, every tree, every lamppost, every signpost. The neighborhood association got the word out. I wrote a blog about it. I'm pretty sure I wasn't the only person in the neighborhood who didn't really know that kid, but we were brought together because we felt like he belonged with us. But that kind of stuff happens all the time, doesn't it? I mean, we even cast our nets out wider. I mean, think about all the times we've had natural disasters and people load up and go and help with the relief efforts, places they don't know, people they don't know, carrying with them the imagination of what would it be like to lose your neighborhood. And we have temporary and occasional neighborhoods where we come together for a concert or a parade, or we come together under the force of music like Krista sang. And just think about that. In those settings, you feel real neighborly. You feel a kinship. It feels like the world is good. You really like that person standing next to you, and you swing and sway with them. And we have this moment of occasional neighborliness and neighborhood. I remember when the eclipse of 2017 occurred, I read a headline that said, "Everybody's eclipse. America comes together under the shadow of the moon." Settings like that and many more give us that sense, that feeling that we are connected. And it's not unusual then for people to share a bottle of water or glasses to see the eclipse or a bottle of beer. We know those feelings. We know that we are wired for that kind of nearness and peacefulness. So whether we're talking about the street we actually live on or the wider sense of neighborliness, we are wired for this kind of feeling of belonging together. But we also know how quickly those occasions can turn out bad. Whether it's the neighbor who lets his dog poop in your yard time after time, or the obnoxious person in the airline terminal with you who's talking loudly and long as if everybody should be interested in what she's saying. We also know that neighborhoods and other groups that form because of their, common-mindedness, things they're working on together, can become tribal, closed off to new people and new ideas and the inevitability of change. Here, the old neighborhood becomes a fortress that must be defended and kept the same, and we romanticize it as our way of life. We've struggled with this nationally on a number of issues, but I think, of course, particularly of the low-income housing shortage. We think we don't want those houses in our backyard, it used to be, but now we say not even in our neighborhood, and there's plenty to read about that. And yet, mustn't we always ask, what would it be like to be caught up in the drama of the neighbor who has no home? As an aside, Los Angeles, of course, like all big cities, is facing the housing crisis. And I read just yesterday that the Methodists in South Los Angeles are looking for ways to use their property and their buildings to help house the homeless. That's an aside I threw in yesterday, having already written the sermon. Historically, it's a battle for us. It has been a battle for us to welcome other ethnicities, races, and social classes into the neighborhoods and schools and workplaces of our society. But we have seen progress, that's true. And in some ways, I think it's right to say we're learning to expand our definition of neighbors. Even if we've learned to expand our definition of neighbors, even if we've been forced to do it. Someone said that if the gospel won't open us up to each other, the ever-changing society certainly will. I think that's an interesting idea, but it seems to be something that we have to remind ourselves of over and over. Maybe that tells us that the gospel, like God, will not be limited to certain houses or neighborhoods. But again, it feels like to me we need to be reminded of that a lot. Well, it makes sense to remember that every major religion makes neighbors the center of its spirituality and its ethics, so that if we want to experience God, it will somehow be through our connection with neighbors. Example from our own scripture, which Tamara read. 2 stories side by side, which taken together show on the one hand hospitality to neighborliness towards strangers, and on the other hostility and violence towards strangers. Now there's several troubling aspects to that second story, with its caricatures of violent men vigilant to humiliate and dominate the strangers in their midst, their obvious disdain for Lot because he was an immigrant, and the ancient code that allowed 4 daughters to be offered up instead of the male house guests. There's many problems, and guess what? So many of them are still so familiar to us. You didn't need to guess, did you? You knew that. So without drilling down too much farther into those 2 stories, it's pretty easy to pick which neighborhood you want to live in, Abraham's or the city of Sodom. The hostility and the violence of the men trying to beat down the door and the father offering up his daughters is their own fire and brimstone. If we'd read further, you would see that the Genesis storyteller says that God rained down fire and brimstone. I think people do it. We rain down our own fire and brimstone with our continual cycles of violence and retaliation, our continual keeping women as property or opportunity and not as autonomous beings. We do these things. There are voices that always question these things and push for change, and they do make it happen. But we know it's always a battle for them, always. Well, I need to wind up, so I want to say this. Neighbors and neighborhoods are cherished and sacred places in our thinking. And there's so much to celebrate about those ideas, and as always, there's so much work to do if we hope to exist, and I mean literally exist together, if we want to live and let live, literally. So since we say each week that ours is not a caravan of despair, I'm going to offer two things, and I'll ask the band to come up now. We have a lot of work to do, even though there's a lot to celebrate. We say ours is not a caravan of despair, so here's two simple ideas. Number one, let us be decent to each other. You know, that doesn't necessarily mean being good, though I'm all for being good, but decency is accepting the flaws of others and counting on the predictable rhythms of reciprocity, which is another way of saying we might get what we give. Accepting that your neighbor's dog poops in the yard sometimes has a guarantee of more peace than starting a Hatfield and McCoy over it. And they might be more willing to accept that your grandchildren's tennis balls keep winding up on the other side of the fence. It's a give and take thing. It's a simple thing that we learned as children, and we can keep that up. One good turn deserves another is a contagion that we can live with. So let's be decent. Number two, let's relate to each other as people first, not as socio-political beings. Politics have their place, but as we well know, they can be poisonous to our shared lives. To state the obvious. People are people first, and if we can just remember that, and if we can remember that people are always more than one thing, more than that one thing we know about them that pretty much sets us on edge. We must learn to remember that and think of that when we relate to each other. Behaving as neighbors with ordinary decency and following our innate, our impulses that we're wired with to care and to help, like Mr. Rogers said, is a kind of rebellion. It's a rebellion against the things that poison our shared existence. But I think that those of us who signed up to be God seekers know this is the rebellion we signed up for. Amen.